The desert wind howled as the U.S. government's Paranormal Investigative Division, PID team stood before the ominous structure of the Goldfield Hotel. It loomed in the heart of Goldfield, Nevada, like a rotting carcass in the middle of a barren wasteland. Built in the early 1900s as a symbol of wealth and fortune, the hotel had long since decayed into a hollow shell of its former self, steeped in darkness and mystery. Commander Jake O'Connor tightened his grip on his flashlight, the eerie glow of dusk casting strange shadows across the crumbling facade. "We need to be ready for anything in there," he said, his voice steady but laced with a tension that didn't escape his team. Behind him, the rest of the team shuffled nervously. Agent Zara Blackwell, a sharp-witted investigator known for her no-nonsense attitude, adjusted the EMF detector strapped to her wrist. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered. "It's like the walls are watching us." The wind picked up, rattling the broken windows like a warning. "Watch for skinwalkers, crawlers, whatever else the locals have whispered about for decades," Jake said, his eyes scanning the twisted shadows cast by the setting sun. As they entered the hotel, the temperature dropped abruptly. The grand lobby, once a vision of luxury, was now a ghost of itself. Broken chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, and every step they took sent a resonating creak through the decrepit floorboards. "Do you hear that?" whispered Miles, the tech expert of the team, as he set up the ghost-hunting equipment. Jake tilted his head. At first, there was only the silence. Then came the faintest sound, like whispering. It seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. A chorus of voices too distant to make out, but undeniably present. "It's like the hotel is alive," Zara said, her voice low. They moved deeper into the hotel, their flashlights flickering against the tattered wallpaper and rotting wooden beams. The place was steeped in a strange, suffocating energy. Every breath felt heavier, every shadow more pronounced. Without warning, the EMF detector in Zara's hand spiked. She froze, her heart pounding. "Something's close," she hissed. Then, a low growl resonated through the hall. It was an inhuman sound, reverberating from deep within the belly of the hotel. Jake signaled for silence, motioning for the team to follow. Their footsteps were barely audible as they crept through the maze of narrow corridors. The growling grew louder, more menacing. They reached a room at the end of the hall, the door half off its hinges. Inside, a rotting, gutted space that might have once been an opulent suite. But now it was a tomb, a place where something vile and ancient lingered. The temperature dropped further, and the whispering grew louder. The voices now felt closer, as if they were right behind them. Then, from the shadows, a figure moved. It wasn't human. The figure emerged slowly from the corner of the room, its limbs unnaturally long, its body twisted like a broken marionette. Its eyes, glowing faintly red, fixed on the team. "A crawler," Zara gasped, stepping back, but Jake held up his hand, forcing her to stay calm. The crawler's joints creaked as it moved toward them, dragging its knuckles along the floor. It was neither fast nor slow, but deliberate, its breath ragged and wet. "Holy, what the hell is that?" Miles whispered, his voice trembling as his equipment went haywire. Lights flashing, readings spiking. "It's been waiting for us," Jake said quietly, his hand hovering near his weapon, knowing full well bullets wouldn't do much against whatever this thing was. The creature paused in the doorway, its head jerking unnaturally as if listening. It sniffed the air, its chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. A wet, guttural snarl escaped its throat, and the air seemed to thicken, the atmosphere becoming oppressive. Then, with a sudden, horrifying speed, it lunged forward. "Move!" Jake shouted, and the team scattered. Zara ducked as the creature's claws slashed through the air where her head had been moments before. Jake raised his flashlight, shining it directly into the crawler's face, but it barely flinched, its focus unrelenting as it tracked their movements. "Back to the stairs!" Jake yelled. "We need to regroup." But before they could make it, the floorboards beneath Miles cracked with a sickening snap, and he plummeted through to the basement level below. "Miles!" Zara screamed, rushing to the hole. They could hear him groaning from the darkness below, but before anyone could react, a second crawler appeared, blocking the exit. This one was larger, its form even more grotesque, its skin hanging loose in patches. They were surrounded. Jake's heart raced. "We fight our way out," he growled. Weapons free. As they prepared for a battle against the impossible, the hotel's walls groaned as though it were breathing. The shadows shifted, and somewhere in the distance, the whispering returned, louder now, as if the very building was watching, waiting for the moment to strike. The team had entered the lair of something far worse than ghosts, and there was no turning back. The sound of Miles groaning from below pierced the air, but the two crawlers advancing on them demanded immediate attention. The hotel's dim light seemed to pulse with malevolence as the creatures closed in, their jagged teeth gnashing as if anticipating a meal. Jake and Zara had only moments to act. "Zara, cover me," Jake barked, drawing his taser, modified for use against paranormal entities. He aimed it at the larger crawler, sending a high-voltage jolt directly into its twisted body. The creature convulsed violently, its screech piercing the oppressive air. But instead of retreating, the shock seemed to anger it further. The second crawler lunged for Zara, its elongated fingers reaching for her throat. She ducked and swung her EMF reader like a club, connecting with the creature's skull. It let out a blood-curdling shriek, staggering back, but she knew that wouldn't stop it for long. "Jake, we have to get Miles out of there," Zara yelled, her heart pounding. Jake shot her a quick nod before pulling a rope from his backpack and tossing it down the hole. "Miles, grab on. We're getting you out." From below, Miles groaned, his voice weak but coherent. Something's down here with me." Jake's blood ran cold. "What do you see?" Before Miles could answer, a low, rumbling growl echoed up from the darkness beneath them. Something massive moved in the shadows, its presence too large to be another crawler. The hotel seemed to hum with dark energy, as if awakening to their intrusion. "We don't have time," Zara said, panic creeping into her voice. "Whatever's down there." Her words were cut off by a sudden crash as the door to the hallway burst open. A new figure stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette. A shadowman. Its face was indistinguishable, hidden in an impenetrable blackness, but its shape shifted, flickering like a dying flame. The air around it warped, and a suffocating sense of dread filled the room. The crawlers froze in place, as if they, too, feared the arrival of this being. Jake's grip on his weapon tightened. "This is not good." The shadowman glided toward them, its movement silent but deliberate. Zara's breath hitched, her body instinctively moving backward, but there was nowhere to go. The stairs were behind them, blocked by the crawlers, and the hole to the basement at their feet. The shadowman stretched out a hand, its fingers long and unnaturally thin. A low whisper filled the room, words neither Jake nor Zara could understand, but they felt them deep in their bones. Suddenly, the lights in the hotel flickered, then plunged the team into complete darkness. Zara's heart raced as the world turned pitch black. The only sounds were the deep, guttural growls of the crawlers and the oppressive silence from the shadowman. Her hand fumbled in the dark for her flashlight, but when she flicked it on, the beam barely pierced the veil of darkness that had overtaken the room. "Jake, we can't fight this thing," she gasped, her voice a thin thread of panic. "We don't have a choice," Jake replied, his voice tight. He reached for the thermal scanner in his bag. "The shadowman's distorting the light. We can't see it, but maybe we can feel it." The scanner's screen glowed with faint heat signatures, but the shadowman registered as nothing. No heat, no life. In the dim glow of the scanner, they saw Miles' trembling figure trying to climb the rope from the basement below. But behind him, something enormous shifted in the darkness, its size monstrous, its form indescribable. A demon. "Jake!" Zara's voice was barely a whisper. Jake followed her gaze, his stomach dropping as the massive entity began to rise from the basement. Its skin was slick, almost dripping with something foul, its eyes glowing a deep, sickening red. The thing let out a slow, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. They had to get Miles out now. "Zara, help me pull him up," Jake shouted, grabbing the rope. Zara dropped her EMF reader and scrambled to his side, grabbing hold of the rope and yanking with all her might. But as they pulled, the demon reached out a clawed hand and grasped Miles' leg, dragging him back down with terrifying ease. Miles let out a scream, his voice raw with terror. "We can't lose him." Zara shouted, her muscles straining. The shadowman suddenly moved forward, passing through Jake and Zara as though they weren't there. It reached out toward the demon, its whispering filling the air again. For a brief moment, the demon hesitated, releasing its grip on Miles. The reprieve was only for a second, but it was enough. They pulled him up, his body collapsing onto the floor at their feet. Zara panted, staring at the shadowman and demon, who seemed to face each other as if locked in some ancient, silent war. "Why aren't they attacking us?" Zara asked, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to move now." Without another word, they hoisted Miles onto his feet, ignoring his gasps of pain, and dragged him toward the exit. As they reached the hallway, the lights flickered back on, revealing the full horror of the room behind them. The shadowman and the demon circling each other, the crawlers skittering to the corners, watching like vultures. Whatever dark forces were at play in the Goldfield Hotel, they had only just begun to reveal themselves, and they were far from done with the team. The hotel's oppressive silence followed them as Jake, Zara, and the wounded Miles made their way down the narrow hallway. The air felt heavy, almost thick, with the weight of unseen eyes watching their every move. The ancient wood beneath their feet creaked as though the building itself was alive, unsettled by their presence. Every step echoed as if something or someone was walking just behind them, mimicking their movements. "We need to find a safe spot to regroup," Jake muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes darted nervously to the peeling wallpaper that seemed to shift in the dim light, like it was breathing. "Safe? In this place?" Zara scoffed, her voice brittle with fear. "We're sitting ducks here." Ahead of them, a staircase spiraled downward into an uninviting darkness. It led to the lower floors of the hotel, once bustling with life, but now a decaying relic, forgotten by time. They knew the basement, where the true horrors of Goldfield lingered, was beneath that. But it felt as though descending those steps would take them deeper into hell itself. Miles groaned, clutching his leg. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. He had barely escaped the clutches of the demon, but something about him was off. His skin looked waxy, as if the hotel had left its mark on him, something beyond physical. "I'll be fine," he muttered, trying to shake off Jake's concerned look. Just keep moving." As they reached the bottom of the staircase, they entered what appeared to be the dining room, though any remnants of its former grandeur had long since faded. Cobwebs hung from the chandeliers, and the once polished tables were now rotting, their surfaces marred by dark stains, blood perhaps. Zara froze. "Do you hear that?" Jake stopped, straining his ears. A faint whisper filled the room, too low to make out clearly, but unmistakably human. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, like the voices of the dead were embedded in the very walls. "Help us, please." The voice was fragile, desperate. Jake turned toward the source, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, each one pleading for something: escape, forgiveness, revenge. Their voices blended into a maddening cacophony that crawled under their skin, driving an icy chill down their spines. I can't take it." Zara clamped her hands over her ears, her face pale with terror. "Make it stop." Suddenly, Miles lurched forward, his body stiffening as if he was being controlled by some unseen force. His eyes glazed over, and he began to speak in a low, guttural voice, a voice not his own. "She's coming. She's coming for all of you." Zara gasped, stepping back. What the hell is wrong with him? Jake grabbed Miles by the shoulders, shaking him hard. "Snap out of it." But Miles' gaze remained distant, his lips moving mechanically. "The lady in white. She waits for you at the altar." A cold breeze swept through the room, snuffing out the flickering lights. The darkness rushed in, enveloping them, and in that darkness a figure emerged, a woman pale as death, her long white dress flowing like mist. Her eyes were hollow, her face gaunt, and her lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. The lady in white. The lady in white hovered just inches above the ground, her lifeless eyes locked onto them. Her presence was suffocating, an ancient and malevolent force that had haunted the halls of the Goldfield Hotel for centuries. Time seemed to slow as the temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the frigid air. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very souls trapped within the hotel were warning them of the terror that was about to unfold. Jake's heart pounded as he tried to move, but his legs felt like lead. Zara, too, seemed frozen in place, her wide eyes fixed on the ghostly figure. "Move," Jake whispered to himself, trying to will his body into action. But it was as if the very atmosphere had turned against them, trapping them in a paralyzing grip. The lady in white slowly raised her arm, pointing a skeletal finger at Miles. A cruel smile crept across her face as Miles' body jerked violently, his limbs twitching as though he were a marionette under her control. "Miles!" Zara screamed, rushing toward him. Before she could reach him, the lady in white opened her mouth, releasing a piercing, otherworldly scream that echoed through the hotel like a death knell. Zara stumbled back, clutching her ears as the sound tore through her skull, overwhelming her senses. Jake's mind raced. He had seen entities like this before, spirits tied to places through some horrific tragedy. But this was different. The lady in white wasn't just a lost soul. She was something darker, something evil, and they were standing in her domain. As if in response to his thoughts, the ground beneath them trembled. The floorboards creaked and groaned, splitting apart to reveal a gaping hole beneath the dining room. From the darkness below, the faint sound of chanting reached them. And then they saw it, a crude, blood-stained altar, surrounded by ancient symbols etched into the walls. "The altar," Miles whispered, his voice no longer his own. "She waits for you." The lady in white floated toward the altar, her dress trailing behind her like a shroud. As she moved, the air became thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Zara, still dazed, struggled to her feet, while Jake tightened his grip on the EMF reader, though he knew it was useless against something like this. "We have to get out of here," Jake muttered under his breath. But there was no escape, not with the lady in white blocking the way, and the altar below pulling them deeper into the heart of the hotel's dark history. Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way entirely, and they plunged into the abyss. They landed hard, dust and debris filling the air as they struggled to regain their bearings. The altar loomed before them, and above it, the lady in white hovered, her eyes glowing with unnatural fury. Jake staggered to his feet, grabbing Zara's hand. "We need to destroy that altar. It's the source of her power." "How?" Zara's voice shook with fear. "We'll figure it out," Jake replied, his eyes narrowing as he pulled out the salt canister from his bag, a desperate, last-ditch plan forming in his mind. But as they approached the altar, the ground shook again, and from the shadows emerged more figures, crawlers, their twisted forms scrambling toward them, their jaws snapping hungrily. The battle for their lives had only just begun. The basement of the Goldfield Hotel was a labyrinth of decaying walls, mold, and flickering shadows. Jake's flashlight trembled in his hand as he and Zara moved cautiously through the underground maze. Behind them, the faint skittering of the crawlers grew louder, their deformed bodies slithering across the dirt floor like predators closing in on prey. "Keep moving," Jake hissed, pulling Zara along. She was still pale, her breath ragged as the weight of their situation pressed down on them. They reached a dead end, but just as Jake was about to curse their luck, Zara pointed to a narrow, half-rotten door in the corner. "There. Maybe we can lose them in there." The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading deeper into the hotel's underbelly. The air was thick with the smell of rot and something metallic, blood, perhaps. Without a word, they descended the stairs, the crawlers' noises echoing behind them. Jake slammed the door shut, hoping the creatures couldn't follow. At the bottom of the stairs, the darkness seemed to have a presence of its own. It wasn't just the absence of light, but something alive, moving around them. The air hummed with an unsettling energy, and Zara let out a quiet gasp as they stepped into what could only be described as a forgotten crypt. Rows of old coffins, some cracked open, lined the walls. Strange symbols, carved into the stone, pulsed faintly with an eerie glow. "This place, it's ancient," Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "This must be where the rituals happened. The hotel, it's built on something older, much older." Before they could react, a shadow shifted in the corner of the room, taller than any human could be. It was like the darkness had taken form, looming over them with its featureless face and elongated limbs. The shadowman, Zara's voice caught in her throat, unable to scream as the thing stepped forward, its body moving with an unnatural grace, like smoke in the wind. Jake fumbled for his equipment, but it was useless. No tech could fight off something like this. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Zara's hand again. But as they turned to flee, the shadowman moved with impossible speed, blocking their path. Its hand reached out, brushing Jake's arm. A cold so deep it felt like death itself washed over him. His limbs went numb, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The shadowman's attention shifted to Zara, who backed into a corner, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might explode. The creature bent toward her, its face, or lack thereof, mere inches from hers. It tilted its head, as if studying her, deciding what to do next. The air around her grew colder, and for a moment, it felt like the very life was being drained from her body. But then, from the shadows behind the creature, a low growl echoed through the crypt. The crawlers had found their way in. Their eyes glinted with hunger as they slithered toward the shadowman, not caring for the humans in their midst. The creature turned, seemingly disinterested in the new arrivals. It vanished into the shadows, leaving Jake and Zara alone with the crawlers. The reprieve was short-lived, however, as the monsters turned their attention back to the two humans. "We need to destroy the altar," Zara whispered, helping Jake to his feet. "It's the only way to stop this." Jake nodded weakly, the cold still lingering in his veins. They had no choice but to face whatever evil had been festering in this hotel for more than a century. But with the crawlers closing in, it felt like a race against time, and death was breathing down their necks. The altar room was suffocating, drenched in the heavy scent of incense and decay. The walls were lined with the remnants of old rituals, charred bones, rusted chains, and symbols that pulsed with a sickening red light. Jake and Zara stood at the center, staring at the altar that had been the source of all their nightmares. Carved from black stone, the altar was etched with symbols of death, and at its center was a deep bowl, stained with old, congealed blood. But it wasn't just any blood. It was from the hotel's victims, collected over years by the malevolent forces that haunted the place. The lady in white had been their puppet, their tool to lure more souls into the depths of the Goldfield Hotel. "We have to destroy it," Jake said, his voice trembling. But how could they defeat something so ancient and evil? Their ghost hunting equipment was useless here. This was beyond any scientific explanation, beyond anything they had ever encountered. Zara, shaking but determined, stepped forward. "Salt," she said. "We need to purify the space." She pulled out a bag of salt from her backpack and began to scatter it around the altar. As the salt hit the floor, the room trembled. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, and a low, guttural sound emanated from beneath the altar. It was a sound that felt wrong, like the earth itself was growling in pain. Suddenly, the room filled with whispers. They were louder now, more insistent. Voices calling out from the past, begging for release, begging for revenge. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the very air turned thick with dread. From the shadows, the lady in white reappeared, her eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. Behind her, the shadowman lingered, its form flickering like a candle flame in the dark. The two entities stood together, a twisted alliance of death and despair. "You cannot stop us," the lady hissed, her voice barely human. Jake took a step back, his heart racing. "We have to try," he muttered, grabbing Zara's arm. But before they could move, the ground beneath the altar cracked open, revealing a pit of darkness so deep it felt like the void itself. From within, something stirred, something far worse than the lady or the shadowman. A demon. The air turned to fire as the creature began to rise, its massive horns scraping the ceiling, its eyes glowing with an infernal rage. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and the entire hotel seemed to shake with the force of its awakening. Zara gasped, clutching Jake's arm. "We're too late." The demon rose higher, towering over them, its presence blotting out everything else. The lady and the shadowman were nothing compared to this force of pure evil. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed the last of their salt, poured it into the bowl at the altar's center, and with a final desperate hope, he lit the match. The room exploded with light. The explosion of light from Jake's match was blinding, swallowing the room in a searing white radiance. The demon let out a guttural roar, shaking the very foundations of the Goldfield Hotel. Its immense body writhed, smoke pouring from its skin, as if the light itself was burning through its essence. But the light didn't last. Within moments, the flames flickered out, leaving the room in a suffocating, thick blackness. Jake and Zara stood frozen, the echo of the demon's roar still rattling their bones. The oppressive darkness pressed in, and a bone-chilling cold gripped the room, as if every last shred of warmth and hope had been sucked out. "We've failed," Zara whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "It's too strong." The demon's massive, shadowy form loomed in the pitch-black abyss, its eyes glowing like hot embers in the night. Slowly, it began to rise again, pulling itself free from the cracked altar. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Jake took a step backward, feeling the weight of their impending doom crashing down on him. "There's got to be another way," he muttered, desperately scanning the room. As the demon fully emerged, the walls of the hotel groaned, and the entire structure seemed to lean inward, like it was being sucked into the abyss with the creature. Strange whispers filled the air, voices of long-dead souls trapped in the hotel, their tortured cries blending with the crackle of flames and the hiss of the demon's breath. Just when it seemed like they would be consumed, a deafening crash echoed through the room. The door to the crypt burst open, and a team of heavily armed soldiers, part of the secret government paranormal unit, stormed in. Their guns, modified with strange tech Jake had never seen, emitted bursts of ultraviolet light and salt rounds, forcing the crawlers and skinwalkers back. "Get down!" one of the soldiers shouted as the team opened fire on the demon. The air filled with the sound of gunfire and the stench of sulfur as the demon recoiled, its hulking body lurching backward. But this was no ordinary battle. The demon's eyes blazed with fury, and with a single swipe of its clawed hand, 3 soldiers were flung across the room like rag dolls. Their bodies hit the walls with sickening thuds, leaving only 2 men standing, desperately firing their weapons. Zara grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to destroy the source, whatever's anchoring the demon to this place." Jake's eyes darted toward the crumbling altar. The ritual. It was never completed. Zara's hand trembled as she pulled out the ritual dagger they had found in the crypt earlier. "It's our only chance." The remaining soldiers were struggling, their weapons ineffective against the creature's growing power. The demon lashed out again, and the ground beneath them split wide, revealing a fiery pit of writhing souls beneath the hotel. The voices from the void grew louder, screams of agony, whispers of the dead, all blending together in a symphony of horror. Jake and Zara knew time was running out. "Go!" Jake yelled, pushing Zara toward the altar as the demon's gaze fixed on them. "Finish the ritual." Zara stumbled toward the altar, her body shaking with adrenaline and terror. The dagger felt like ice in her hands as she reached the cracked bowl of blood. Behind her, Jake struggled to keep the demon's attention, throwing anything he could find at the hulking creature. The remaining soldiers were no more, their bodies strewn across the room like broken toys. Only the demon's fiery gaze and its thick, smoke-laden breath filled the space now. The entire hotel seemed alive, the walls groaning and twisting as if they too were possessed. Zara plunged the dagger into the heart of the altar, chanting the words they had found carved into the stone in the crypt. The air around her buzzed with energy, and the ground beneath her feet vibrated violently. The demon let out a screeching roar, its entire body convulsing as if the altar itself was tied to its soul. Shadows twisted and writhed around it, the walls shaking so violently that chunks of ceiling began to fall. But it wasn't enough. The demon turned its gaze on Zara, its red eyes burning with fury. With a monstrous lunge, it flew toward her, its claws outstretched and ready to tear her apart. Suddenly, from beneath the floorboards, the lost souls of the hotel, the forgotten victims of its dark past, began to rise. Their translucent forms materialized, surrounding the demon. Their spectral hands grabbed onto the creature, pulling it down into the ground, into the abyss from which it had come. Jake rushed to Zara's side, his breath ragged. "It's working," he gasped. But the battle was far from over. The demon thrashed against the souls, trying to break free from their grip. Zara's voice cracked as she continued the chant, her hand clutching the dagger as the ground buckled beneath them. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the demon was dragged into the fiery pit, its form disappearing into the darkness. The ground sealed itself shut, and a deafening silence fell over the room. Zara collapsed into Jake's arms, both of them shaking with exhaustion. The eerie glow of the symbols on the walls flickered out, leaving the room bathed in darkness. They had won, if you could call it that, but the cost was immeasurable. The hotel was destroyed, the soldiers dead, and the once grand structure of the Goldfield Hotel lay in ruins. As they made their way back to the surface, the oppressive weight of the hotel seemed to lift. But in the back of their minds, they both knew this wasn't the end. Something still lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting. The Goldfield Hotel had many secrets left to tell, and the devil in its walls would rise again.